Hi. Um, Good afternoon. I don't know what time it is in Germany, but this reading is going to be the beginning of a series that I'm just going to read chapter by chapter my book Strange Fire in a Vacuum because one of my subscribers left me some pretty detailed and insightful comments. So thank you, Instant Kiwi 1005. Sorry, I asked you in one of my replies where you were located. It's clear to me now that you're in Germany, and I was replying on my phone on my lunch break, so I was in a hurry, not paying attention to details. But Instant Kiwi has observed some acts of violence with in Germany, in Europe. One I do remember he mentioned or she mentioned here in Germany one Christmas market, one union gathering where these are two separate incidents, I think, where people have used their cars to kill and injure people gathered in crowds. And so part of the thesis of my book, Strange Fire in a Vacuum, was that I actually predicted that mass shootings would drop off, but more organized political violence would kick up. And here in the United States, there's some debate about what kinds of acts of violence constitute what we are calling stochastic terrorism. I don't think, for instance, a woman named Heather Heyer was killed in Charlottesville, North Carolina, when a far right a far right protester at the Unite the Right rally drove into a crowd of counter protesters. And many of the counter protesters were involved in Black Lives Matter. And so there is a lot to unpack. I'm really, really thankful for your comments. It's very validating, and I cannot thank you enough. Um, I was just having lunch with a friend, and I was telling him how excited I was to come home and do a reading because I did work very hard on this book, and then because I didn't promote it at all, it kind of went into the vacuum of the interwebs where it is still for sale. But I didn't really get much in the way of feedback, and I even felt like criticism or negative reviews would be better than the radio silence that I was experiencing. Then I moved on to other projects. But now, for example, today is a very bad day in America. Today, my boyfriend is attending a No Kings protest in DC. I feel like chicken shit for staying home. However, I am concerned because of something that happened with me in 2019 that if I go to a protest and I am swept up in a mass arrest situation, that I will not get released. And I am not a criminal. Um, the way that the political situation is shaking out in this country, I stand behind that statement. I am not a criminal. I am a political dissident. I have not broken any laws. I have not been charged with any crimes. That I am terrified, and I am observing the news, and my analysis is that we are in the initial phases of a second civil war. So I thank you again, Instant Kiwi 1005, for inspiring me to do this because, in a way, it is it's something that I can do to resist. And it's not a surprise to me that this person is in Germany noticing these events, um, and making the connections between what he or she is hearing, um, on my videos about this book and these events, because there appears to be some crossover politically. This neo-Nazi booster club that Elon Musk is the center of. I have been following news about his involvement in the rise of the AfD. Um, I hope that those of you in Germany successfully quash that activity before Musk and his ilk are allowed to do what they have done here in America with the government. I literally today met a woman as I was getting my nails done whose husband works for FEMA. They have been through the ringer. They are all kinds of stressed out because every single day it's up in the air whether or not he will have a job. It's created chaos. And then this morning the news broke that two Minnesota state legislators and their spouses were killed in what they are calling a targeted incident. The perpetrator or perpetrators dressed as policemen, posed as policemen, walked right up, and they killed these legislators, these elected officials in Minnesota. So, all I can say is we're all doing our best to maintain our hope and sanity. Whatever form of resistance your resistance takes is the right form, even if it means staying home and tending to your self-care. Um, it's just a very bitter, bitter feeling. I didn't want to be so correct in my predictive analysis because I knew that it would be bad for my country if I were correct. I read, after I wrote the book, I'm gonna look it up. The man who is Canadian, Dispatches from the American Civil War, I believe it's called. This is a Canadian novelist who undertook Steven Marche, Stephen Marche or Steven Marche. I'll put a link to his book in the description. He's a novelist and a journalist, and he did his own analysis of the likelihood that America would devolve into a civil war theater. And I read that book. I thought it was very good. I'm not a tactical person. I'm more of I look at things with a mindset of getting inside the minds of these actors and figuring out what's motivating them, what's driving them. So that I have worked with people who are much more tactically minded than me. So for instance, I had a job monitoring inmate phone calls in Pennsylvania, and my supervisor was doing a lot of work um, in terms of preparedness for mass shootings in her community because she had school-age children and she wanted to be out, and she had been an EMT and she had been married to a police officer, and they wanted to make sure she wanted to make sure that if these if the risk of life would the risk of death rather, and the loss of life in these incidents could be minimized. So there are all kinds of political opinions left and right. about whether or not we need more school resource officers, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, what I see is we've moved on from having a blanket concern that quote unquote madmen with guns will just gun down people at concerts and the like. And now, actually, in Minnesota, people are being told not to go to political protests today, to shelter in place because the risk is so high. So we've moved into the full blown, in my opinion, political violence phase. Now, writing nonfiction is not something I ever imagined that I was going to do. And then when I wrote it, um, I thought about nonfiction authors that I really respect, like Chris Hedges, Sebastian Younger, Johan Hari, and Matt Taibbi. And I thought, well, that must be kind of awkward to do that for a living because these guys are so good, they're so smart. And then the more timely a book is, the less of a shelf life it actually has. Do you know what I mean? So, um, I guess it's a very awkward feeling because I wanted my book to be a timely analysis, but I wanted it to have a short shelf life because I wanted us to get past the mass shootings as a society. And instead, we have, but what we've moved on to is actually more grim and in some ways more frightening. That said, I'm going to begin with the introduction. Oh, and this is my way of lodging my protests. This is a group that has come up in my feed a lot. I really support what they're doing. I wish I still believed in God so I could say things like, God help us, and be a little bit honest. Anyway, introduction. It opens with a quote from Donald Trump. I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, okay, and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible. That was from January 22nd, 2016. I thought it was a law of nature that things ignite more readily in a vacuum, but it turns out that is contrary to fact. Physics teaches us that things can indeed burn in a vacuum, but they burn differently. In order to fuel a fire, oxygen gas must usually be present. In ordinary earthly conditions, the pull of gravity draws cold air down as heated air expands and rises upward. In outer space, where there is no gravity, fires are eerily tranquil in appearance and they move slower. There is no displacement of heated molecules with cold. They are not shaped like tulip buds, but more like incandescent worms. NASA, that is our National Space Travel, I forget what the acronym stands for. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It's a government agency. It's a government. Yeah. NASA is researching how fire behaves in space to make their expeditions safer. So far, they have concluded that, in spite of its lava lamp slow creeping appearance, the fire in space can be, quote, less predictable and potentially more lethal, unquote, than fire on Earth. Mass shooters and their motivations have left us stumped. The analysis offered in popular media seems faulty and inadequate, even as these shootings happen more frequently and with greater casualties. It feels as if we are dealing with a new alien form of fire. This criminal behavior is similarly less, quote, less predictable and more lethal, unquote, than other forms of criminal behavior. The lone wolf killer is now an indelible figure in our American consciousness. Americans can sense intuitively that life is more combustible. In terms of the popular fear factor they arouse, mass shootings have displaced terrorist explosions orchestrated by foreign actors as the reigning terror of our day. The current period of political and social instability is very reminiscent of the late 1960s and early 1970s, only worse. The seeming randomness of these crimes leaves Americans witnessing them feeling perhaps more helpless and despairing than Americans who were reacting to the carnage of the Vietnam War and events of the late 1960s and 1970s, because we cannot ascribe a motive to these crimes. We feel powerless to predict when and where the next mass shooting will occur. And here I'm going to make a note, okay? When I say that is very reminiscent of the late 1960s and early 1970s, I just wish to make a note that there was a lot of political violence in my country at that time, but also violent crime rates were far worse at that time. People were much more likely to be mugged. There was much concern in the cities, particularly New York, heroin dealing, drug crimes, stabbings, serial killers, kidnappings. That all steadily declined in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And then you had a series of political narratives start to be constructed around violent crime rates. And this is where you started to see around the time in my lifetime. Was happening with Reagan, but I recall more because I was just a child when Reagan was president. More the politicization around violent crime with the Clintons, and that's when I really started to pay attention to how people used and misused crime stats for political ends. But to me, all of that crime, that's not what the book is about. It's about mass shootings, and it's about the tie-in to specifically organized, polarized, terroristic type groups. Okay. So violent crime, most Americans don't realize that there was a steep decline, and it was maintained for 2 decades at least, in 3 decades even in this country. Anyhow, so it's not like we in some ways the average citizen still with mass shootings didn't have it as bad as somebody growing up in the wrong neighborhood, say, in the 70s. But the mass shootings, in terms of the psychological impact, yes, that is very bad. Okay. We are dealing with a sensational epidemic, but we need to understand the properties of the problem that is indeed, quote, less predictable and potentially more lethal, quote, than other forms of violence. Below is a summary of my key points about mass shooters. Number 1, mass shooters are of 2 types: the psychotic and non-psychotic. This book concerns only the non-psychotic type. Okay, here I wish to make another note. One of the flaws in this book is that while I was beginning to do some of the research, basically critiquing and taking apart the mental health care system in this country. I was not yet far enough in this research to be able to state what Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring is now talking about on his channel, and I will put a link in the description. Um, I did not. Another flaw is I didn't get into any analysis of the kinds of shooters, and because they are a minority. They are a very small minority, in my opinion. Although maybe not as small as Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring would think. Okay, because he's a board certified psychiatrist, and he is a vocal critic of psychotropic drugs. So part of the problem is that we don't know how many mass shooters are actively having an adverse reaction to, say, antidepressants. Antidepressants can stimulate people to suicide or homicide, and this is a very, very underreported phenomenon because the drug industry doesn't want you to know. They don't want you to know. And the adverse effect is particularly bad in men. So I just didn't have it all together to maybe I will make an addendum or an appendix for the book. Maybe he will help me with that. But it is frightening. Law enforcement often does not have access to the medical records, and I don't understand that. Later in the book, I was discussing with an FBI agent, and he was saying that he was trying to get the medical records for Stephen Paddock, a mass shooter who in Nevada killed, I think, was something like 49 people who were gathered for a rock concert. This is important for investigators to have access to, and I don't understand why HIPAA or anything would get in the way of that. But more and more, we're making some connections between psychotic violent behavior and or actors on psychotropic drugs and violence. But that is a major flaw in this book that I'm reading from. Anyway, let's move on. Number 2. Mass shootings are a variation not of homicide, but of suicide. Number 3, mass shooters are not mentally ill by most standard definitions. They are, most of them, capable of logic at the time of their crimes. They are exhibiting goal-directed behavior when they carry out their massacres. They are not, quote unquote, motiveless. Rather, the motive is diffuse. diffuse. Its root causes are social and not strictly the result of abnormal psychology. Some of these motivations operate at the subconscious level of these killers. Number 4, mass shooters are narcissists, both resistant to and untreatable by most mental health care systems and paradigms. Number 5, therefore, the non-psychotic majority of mass shooters are not people who, quote, fall through the cracks, unquote, of the mental health system. They are more than likely rebelling against authority and perceive the mental health care system as a form or extension of an authority they dislike intensely. Number 6, mass shooters are suffering from existential despair, not a conventionally treatable despair, like one simply wrought from trauma, abuse, or interpersonal loss. They perhaps already know that mental health care cannot help them or make them happy. Their despair is also deeper than politicized rebellion against any one group or government. Although they may nurture a delusion that they can isolate a particular group or issue as a cause of their rage. This delusion may be inflamed by their engagement with mass media, which is itself compounded by the shooter's media illiteracy. And now in the United States, we have this new term that's cropping up in the news: historic or historical illiteracy. They may fall prey to or concoct conspiracy theories because of their media illiteracy. They are seeking freedom and autonomy, but of a kind that cannot be satisfied by alliances with any particular cause or movement. So, here, what I'm talking about, what I'm making a profile of, is the lone wolf killer. Okay. And then later in the book, I talk about how we go from the lone wolf killer to Proud Boys, neo-Nazi terrorist groups in Europe, probably Ireland's probably got a few street gangs, politicized, the borderline between political militia types and what have you. Okay, so can be both sides of the political spectrum too. There's been plenty of violence connected to Black Bloc or other types of, and Antifa types. So it's not, I'm not strict, I'm just saying. Okay, so this is also why in most cases their victims appear chosen at random. If they are not operating under a delusional, racist, sexist, or homophobic grudge, they're generalizing the despair to include anyone and everyone outside of themselves. Number 7. Although many mass shooters are white and middle class, this reflects the population at large here in the United States. This demographic of shooter gets an undue amount of reaction in the national press, however. Mass shooters who are both white and middle class belong to a demographic that, rightly or wrongly, is taken as representative of a cultural and political decline and fracturing in our society. These shooters and their non-criminal counterparts in the alt-right, white supremacist, and men's rights movements seem particularly vulnerable to existential despair and prone to airing such despair through extreme acts or extreme speech. In some sense, privilege begets an existential vacuum in this globally entitled class, precisely because they already are presumed to have the height of power at their disposal. This is the story they're told of themselves in the mass media. And when they feel instead powerless over modern conditions, when such presumed power turns out to be a useless chimera, unsatisfying to their existential problems, and even more bitter hopelessness and rage ensues. Mass shooters do not like modern post-industrial society. Number 8. They are alienated in the extreme, not only from a particular family unit, culture, workplace, or peer set, but from all of reality as they have known it. This is what they mean to communicate in their acts. This is the statement they are making with randomized and often depersonalized targets. They were presaged by the Unabomber, whose manifesto offers us a number of insights into them. As long as they are mischaracterized, as was the Unabomber, as merely mentally ill, we will fail to understand what drives them, and so fail to make any changes to the structure of our society and culture that would potentially reduce the incidence of mass shooters. Number 9, mass shooters are reacting to the surveillance state, of which the mental health system is an ever-evolving and ever-encroaching part. They cannot be combated through the enhancement of said surveillance state, nor should they become a rallying point for those who would wish to curtail basic civil liberties in America in the name of public safety. Number 10. Mass shooters are symptomatic of a decline in democratic norms and values in America. They signal the degree to which individuals are reacting to a political system that is largely hollow, increasingly theatrical, and absurd. They are harbingers of a militant and violent reaction to the collapse of meaningful democratic outcomes in America as Americans refuse to acknowledge and act on class struggle. Mass shootings are precursor events foreboding a turn to and normalization of large-scale acts of politically motivated violence by domestic terrorist groups. In the early 2000s, terrorism opened up a wound of vulnerability in our cultural psyche. But terrorism has the benefit of being explainable. It is made for analysis and commentary and political reaction formation. One could even say that terrorism has enhanced our sense of national identity, our cohesiveness. In contrast, mass shootings are domestic, internal, and completely confounding to the mechanisms of prediction and containment we have created in our anti terror apparatus of the post 9/11 state. They are, rather than a wound we can plug with compensatory and patriotic rhetoric, a gaping and horrifying hemorrhage. The boogeyman is no longer out there in a foreign land practicing strange rites and preaching religious jihad. No, the boogeyman is in here, among our fellow Americans, hiding in plain sight. The boogeyman is our mistrust of ourselves, our public spaces. The lone gunman's motivations seem completely unscripted. No one radicalized him in the desert. Rather, we did, somehow, if we only knew how. Hemingway wrote a book about bullfighting. It is called Death in the Afternoon. Now, in America, it is death all day. Mass shootings have become so frequent and so deadly, the tally of deaths so great now, that if the shooters were connected by a single cause, group affiliation, or religious or political ideology, no observer could reasonably fail to call their cumulative damage revolutionary, anti-establishment activity of a guerrilla type. During the 1960s and 1970s, anti-government domestic terrorist organizations such as the Weathermen and the SLA, I think it was called the something Symbionese Liberation Army, something like that, as well as Charles Manson and his mesmerized murderous henchmen, never actually killed as many people as mass shooters have since the early 1990s. So the question remains, if taken together, and if in effect, but not by design, these shootings are revolutionary anti-establishment activity, is there a common cause or grievance they are meant to address? If so, what is it? Thank you again, InstantKiwi1005. I hope you are well.